I'm not sure about you, but with the return of solo cash cups, I'm super excited to grind some more solos to get to the top. So just for you guys, I went out and found a ton of tips that nearly no one knows about and that pros are abusing in order to win solo cash cups, so you guys can too. Let's start with your first game. You don't need to play super risky in your first game and go for refreshes and kills a lot. You just need to play really consistently for placement and endgame, because in the current format, going for kills when you don't really need them is just not worth it. If you do end up winning your first game, then just aim to be consistent for the rest of the tourney, because the lobbies will get a lot harder. A really important general mindset tip for any tournament is to not get discouraged if you die. If you won every game, you wouldn't get to play all of your games, so it is okay to lose some. Just remember the aim of the tournament is to gain points over 10 games, not to win every game. LOS, or line of sight, is a really underrated way to get easier rotates. You need to abuse it to save mats by scouting and thinking about who can see you and who will shoot you when you rotate. If you can find a path where the least amount of players can see you, then simply less people will shoot at you and you'll get a better rotate. Something else that's even more unknown is a strat to find refreshes called red line theory. You haven't heard of that one, have you? Red line theory is basically the idea that you should position yourself further into moving zones, especially after they've actually stopped moving, because people will pile up at the back end of the moving zone and then you'll be able to get free refreshes from the safer side of zone. The red line is just an imaginary line at a point where you are in front of all players in the lobby, and so you'll be able to find refreshes the easiest. I swear literally no one other than the pros knows this, so you better write it down.
Write that down, write that down!
So with launchpads in this meta, there are a ton of old and new tips around using them that people have either forgotten or don't even know yet. First up, you need to use your launchpads early, because as the endgame goes on, launchpads will become less and less valuable because they're generally harder to use and they won't get you as far into the zone because the zones just aren't as big. This means that in terms of mat saves on a rotate, they're worth less as the game goes on. You also need to make a point of deciding how you'll use your launchpads as early as possible. There are so many ways to use a launchpad. You can pad normally, do various short pads, or even a bounce pad effect where you don't even deploy your glider. I can guarantee that all of these will come in handy during at least one of your games, so it might sound weird, but you should actually spend some time practicing launch padding in creative. You need to practice them until you can get them all down instantly, because sometimes it can be the difference between a win and getting beamed out of the air. Speaking of getting beamed out of the air, if height is shooting at you while you're padding, instead of flying away from them, fly toward them and duck and weave underneath their tarp and around their builds to stop them from seeing you. However, a more general tip when flying is to not go out in the open a lot and to use things like dead side, trees, or other builds to not get focused. Always look to scout to find a pad to reuse. If you see someone who you know has a pad because they aren't rotating for a while, or you see them looking up a lot to check if they can place one, acting really aggressively on them as if you're going to just jump into their box can cause them to panic pad, and then you'll have a free rotate. Oftentimes you'll be able to beam them or pump them as they go for the pad as well, and then you can just follow them in the air and land in their box for a free kill. You really wouldn't want that happening to you though, so whenever you do go to reuse a pad, make sure you build protection all the way over it and build walls around it before flying away. Don't ever land full frontside when you use a pad, because with all the laggy chaos in the endgame, someone will just fly straight into your box and then you'll probably end up dead. Just land a bit back or on dead side and then tarp into zone from there. Trust me, the mats you use will be worth it. If you ever need a refresh and you still have decent mats, never jump straight into someone's box. Try to play from a distance and use blueprint edits to get tags. After you do get damage onto someone, if you don't crack them, it's most likely not worth chasing them down to secure the kill. If you don't manage to get that refresh that runs away, then you should focus on getting another one by tarping to the front of the zone, then looking back and trying to find someone. You never want to look forward in the zone for a refresh, because those people in front of you have an advantage over you and will just hold you, and you also don't want to look up to find a kill either, because it's just too hard to eliminate people above you unless they're unaware and you chop them out. Also, try to remain really confident even if you have no mats and need a refresh. Okay, another general mentality related tip is that the reality of solos is that you will die off spawn. If it happens to you, don't worry, it happens to the top pros as well, even the people who win the cash cups. Just refocus and continue with the next game. Now, seeing as as the last part of the video was mostly on getting refreshes, I figured that we should probably talk about how to preserve your materials in Endgame so you can minimize the risk that comes with a refresh, because no matter how safe a refresh is, it would always just be safer to have more mats and not go for a kill. Now that I think about it, it probably would have made sense to talk about saving your mats before getting a refresh. So first up, you should always be tarping in wood if no one is shooting you or looking at you. But if someone ever starts to shoot at you, immediately switch to hard mats. You should always make a 2x1 in hard mats after you get into the zone to have some space to look around safely and plan out your next rotate, look for refreshes, and check height. Always look up at height. If you do want height, a very simple way to take it is just to get to the front side of zone, and if you're not being pressured, shoot out height, beam them as they fall, and boom. Big emphasis on tagging them while they fall because they won't build fight you and try to take height back. Don't be too greedy for height though, especially in earlier zones. Even if you get it free on first moving and then someone comes to contest you, just drop down immediately and let them have it and focus on rotating and taking height later in the game where it will actually be useful in giving you that win. Taking height doesn't have to be hard. Simply scouting and timing the height take correctly can get you easy high ground more often than you would expect. It's common knowledge that if you're on height, you should spray the person's second height. But what's not so common knowledge is that especially towards the end of the game, like in the second last and last zones, your second priority to be spamming if there's no one dangerously close to your height is anyone building out of hard mats, because they are the most stacked players in the lobby, so they'll have a higher chance of taking the win from you than players who only have wood left. The reason this is especially important in the last zones is that people in the zones before will tarp in wood on purpose, like the tip I talked about before. This means that the players using hard mats in those earlier zones will actually be the worst players, so you shouldn't focus on them. Being on height is always a great way to win games and get more eliminations, but you can't have it every game, so you're going to have to know how to play other layers as well.
5 hours later.
Pre-tarping is where you build ahead of you before the zone starts moving, and if you do it in hard mats before first moving, you can find really easy rotate paths and refreshes. Pre-rotates are really useful if you get a bad zone, and especially in that first moving. Speaking of first moving, you should never ever play low ground in first moving, and you should also try your very best to not do it in second either. This is because it's just really scuffed down there, and all the people who haven't played their mid games properly and have no mats will be looking for a refresh, and you'll just get griefed. You want to mostly be on a mid-ground layer with little people on it. You want to change layers often though, so it's hard for your opponent to track you and get a refresh on you if they're following you.
But Shem, don't you want to just find a layer and stick to it, not change layers all the time?
Well, I'm glad you asked. And yes, you mostly want to find a good layer to just chill on. However, you should never be afraid of changing layers, especially if you're getting shot at, and it's just really good to practice them. However, there are exceptions to this general rule of mostly chilling in a mid-ground layer. If you get a refresh in later zones, then you should start layering up and look at height from front side. After you get an elimination endgame, by the way, if their loot's in storm, just take a split second to look at it and figure out what you want to pick up. It can save you a storm tick or two, and that can be the difference you need sometimes. Speaking of getting loot, you don't need to be greedy for loot, because having a guaranteed top 3 with the loot you have is better than risking a game on random loot in storm and having a 50-50 chance of winning the game or just dying to storm in 10th. If you're getting sprayed or focused, you need to prioritize blocking LOS from the people who are shooting at you. Even if this takes you to a place where more people could shoot at you, it'll just be so much better because they won't spam you as hard, if at all, because they don't know you've already taken damage. Now that you know how to survive moving zones, let's get on to some tips for closing out games and claiming victory royales. Nowadays, most matches end in either heel-offs or just straight right-hand jump peeking from height. However, there are 2 quick tips that I have for closing out the game. The first one is to spam your opponent's mat sources. If your opponent is trying to farm because there's 0 mats, which most people are in the last zone, spray out anything they're farming to grief their mats. And the other tip is to just always take safe right-hand peeks from height, and that will mostly pretty easily close out matches.